Welcome to this seminar titled Interconnected Crises, ISIS, Iran, and Israel. This seminar is being put on at Hiram College by one of the college's 7 centers of distinction. In this case, it's the Garfield Center for Public Leadership. I'm James Thompson, director of the center, and I am delighted to have you here today to talk about a topic that is infinitely complicated. In fact, almost impossibly complicated. In fact, impossibly complicated. That's the Middle East I used to know. That is the Middle East that most of us have known for a very long time, a Middle East full of states. And what's happened of late is that many of those states have ceased to exist, as far as I can tell. If I can do this carefully. There we have it. That is the state formerly known as Syria. If you look at that map for a second, I'll just give you a second to take it in. The red portion, the bright red portion, is the part that is still controlled by the regime of Syria. So if you see that, that's got to be less than a tenth of that country. Does anyone know, curious to see, what the dark gray and light gray represents? Who controls that? It's one group that represents... Oh! Thank God someone knows.
I didn't know, are we being graded?
You are. I'm sure, I forgot to mention that. Does anyone know in the audience? Yeah. Yeah, it's this thing called ISIS. They control a lot of Syrian territory at this point. If you note down in the lower left, which would be the southwest, that's Israeli. The blue is Israeli. If you notice some of the yellow there on the western side, the lighter bits of yellow, is this group called Hezbollah. If you see the yellow at the top, the bright yellow, that's the Kurds. And we can go on and on. This is a state that is effectively, as far as I can tell, ceased to exist. This was all complicated enough when there were states. Now when a state is that many pieces, this is why we bring in the experts. If we take it to the next slide, that's the state formerly known as Iraq. Again, the dark gray and light gray represents ISIS control. In this case, the yellow is the Kurds. And the red, see who's smart here, one of our students maybe, what does the red represent? Yeah.
The Iraqi government?
It's the Iraqi government, which is run by what ethnic group? Yeah.
Shiite?
It's run by the Shiites. The ISIS group, which is gray and gray, version gray, is which ethnic group? Yeah.
Syria.
It's Sunni, absolutely right. So you have the Sunnis, the Kurds, the Shiites. Again, states that were states now looking very different. Yemen. There used to be a state called Yemen. And you could go there, and it was there, and you could count on it being there. It is not really there anymore, as far as any of us can tell. The group there, you can see on the far left, on the far west, on the Red Sea, is a Shiite group. Other parts, the gray, are controlled by groups that are, I believe, affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and the rest is various other things. So, actually, just to go back to this map, several of those states, at least 3 already, are highly questionable. But if we keep going, get to Lebanon. No offense to anyone who's Lebanese, but I don't know if Lebanon was ever there. Lebanon is a state that was created out of multi-different groups, multi-ethnic state, brought together to form a new state filled with people of very different ethnic groups, not only Sunni and Shiite, but a variety of others. And if you'll note, there's areas that are controlled by the Shia that are controlled by a group called Hezbollah. And if we go to the next slide, Hezbollah, you can see it there. Lebanon is on the lower left. I'm sorry, some of you might not be able to see this. Around the edge of Lebanon is the Hezbollah infiltration into the surrounding territory, which is Syria. And the interesting thing about this map is that there's also something else going on in here. Now it's not just groups that are in the area, but there are images of something else. And what those something else's are attacks by an outside military force. Now, see if another student knows the answer to this. And he's actually still in high school, yeah?
Russia.
That'd be the Russians. As if the Syrians didn't have enough going on in Syria, the Russians decided to get involved in Syria. And those are the maps of their attacks. Now, in case that wasn't complicated enough, there's this gentleman. Does anyone know who this gentleman is? Yeah.
An Iraqi war gentleman?
Ironically, kind of yes, but he's not from Iraq. Tom.
He's an Iranian, like, foreign force general, one of the top really Iraqi.
Yeah, he's basically one of the top, or the top military figure in Iran. I think I heard you say Iran. Yeah. And he's in charge of something called the Quds Force, very, very powerful man, and has been sent in by the Iranians to Syria, to Iraq, to engage in a lot of military activities there. Well, he, if I understand correctly, based on reports, that's all I can read, was the one who was sent to Russia by Iran to convince the Russians to bomb in Syria. Okay, so the Iranians are asked, or go to the Russians to ask them to bomb the Syrians, who are their allies, bomb the people who are fighting the Syrian regime. This is a map of the course of the missiles that were sent from the Russian ship into Syria. One of the interesting things about this, they were sent from the Caspian Sea because they have a naval component of the Russian Navy is in the Caspian Sea. And I only know what I've read, but my understanding of what this naval fleet has been doing in the Caspian Sea prior to recent events was basically, not to put too fine a point on it, smuggling caviar. And as a result of that, when they fired the missiles towards Syria, they didn't actually all get there. Or so the report is, the missiles actually landed, some of them, partway in Iran. So just to recap, the Iranians go to the Russians to ask them to bomb the Syrians. The Russians say yes, they then try to bomb the Syrians, and the Russians end up bombing parts of Iran. Now, we don't have this confirmed. In fact, our guests might be able to speak to this much better about whether this actually happened, but this was a Wall Street Journal story. The Russians are denying that they actually bombed the people who asked them to bomb Syria, but I don't know if that's confirmed or not. Oh. There we go. Hold on. Okay. Then we come to this guy, and this will almost end, and we'll have our guest speaking, but just to give you a quick roundup. So this guy is Brigadier General Hussein Hamadani, who is another very high-ranking member of the Iranian military. And he was sent to, into what is formerly Syria to help parts of the Iranian or Syrian regime fight a group called ISIS, which we already mentioned. He was just killed. Now I'm incapable of operating technology. He was just killed in. There we go. He was just killed in Syria fighting ISIS. So the Iranians are asking the Russians to bomb the Syrians. They're also fighting ISIS in Syria. And while they're doing all of that, in case you're trying to keep watch of this, they are negotiating arms agreements with the rest of the world about their nuclear energy and potentially military capacity. This agreement on the nuclear proposal was just, this agreement on nuclear development was just finalized, and we're going to have one of our guests talk about that. So they're negotiating with everyone else around the world about doing nuclear development while they're also engaged in all this other military activity in the Middle East. A lot of people in the Middle East are not happy that they're engaging in a nuclear negotiation, such as this gentleman. This, of course, is the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, making a comment about how the Supreme Leader of Iran is tweeting about the need to wipe out Israel, but of course they don't really allow freedom of press in Iran. He's upset about this nuclear deal. Guess who else is upset about this nuclear deal? This is a little cartoon demonstrating the point. The Saudis are really concerned about the nuclear deal because they are assuming the Iranians are Shiite, there's a rivalry, and now there's a concern that because of this deal, the Iranians are going to develop their nuclear capacity, which may amplify their ability to eventually develop nuclear weapons, depending on who you talk to. The Saudis want support from the Americans and want to develop their own capacity in response to the Iranian buildup. Meanwhile, just finishing this off, the Saudis are also engaged in bombing what used to be Yemen. And in fact, that is the coalition of states from all over the world. They have gotten together to go after various people in Yemen, in particular the Shiites in Yemen who are associated with the Shiites in Iran. And one more slide or two. Meanwhile, the Saudis are negotiating with the Turks because both the Turks and the Saudis don't like the regime in Damascus, Syria, and so they are working with something called the Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, to help take down the Damascus regime. At the same time, the Turks are fighting the Kurds, and who are all in that same region at the same time, and there was just a major explosion in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. Just last weekend, over 100 people died, last I read, a massive bombing. In fact, I think those are bodies covered in the flags that were saying, we want a peaceful Turkey. And people are blaming the regime in Ankara, they're also blaming ISIS. So the Turks are now fighting ISIS, but they're also fighting the Kurds, or to sum this all up, Turkey is fighting the Kurds, who are fighting ISIS, which is fighting Turkey, which supports the Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate, which is getting bombed by Russia at the request of Iran and on behalf of the Syrian regime. Clear? Everybody got it? Okay. So that's the American response. That is the Secretary of Defense of the United States, whose name is, of course, Ashton Carter, the guy from high school, okay? So Ashton Carter gave a speech last Friday to talk about the American policy in Turkey and in the Middle East in general. It's particularly important because Turkey is a NATO ally, which means that it is part of this alliance, which, thanks to Article 5 in the NATO Treaty, means an attack on one is an attack on all. It doesn't mean that if Turkey gets into a war, the United States, which is also NATO, has to be in that war, but it makes things very serious for all those NATO allies. So the United States, among other reasons, has to be very concerned with what's going on there in Syria on the Turkish border. So the policy the United States has been putting in place, and this is what Ashton Carter was addressing on Friday, has been a $500 million policy of training up people from Syria, taking them out of Syria, training them up, and then sending them back into Syria to fight the Nusra Front, ISIS, the regime in Damascus, and now the Russians and the Iranians. So that would be a fun job. It has been confirmed that the total number of guys who were trained up through this $500 million program, quite literally, this is the quote, it's a handful. There are only a handful of men, fighters, who have been confirmed having been sent back into Syria. And if you do the math, that's one guy per opponent. So one guy for Nusra Front, one guy for ISIS, one guy to take down the Damascus regime, one guy to deal with the Russians, one guy to deal with the Iranians. There are two ways to interpret all that. Either this policy is a massive policy failure, or those guys are some very serious guys. In any event, you can sort of get the body language. They decided to go with the former interpretation, and they are ending the program. They are canceling. They are canceling the. They are canceling the program. They're not going to continue with that funding, and that leaves us with a really important question, which is, what should U.S. policy be in a situation that is this complicated, this confusing? I'm confused again, just having gone through that list of slides. It's unclear what to do here. We need expert advice, and that's why we brought our guests for today, Ms. Dalia Dasake and Mr. Andy Liebman, who are going to get appropriate introductions here in just a minute by a Garfield scholar who's been professionally trained for this role. So she's going to come up and introduce them. I'll simply say one point about each of them that I can offer at this point. By the way, they're both coming from the RAND Corporation, which is an extremely influential and important think tank, but there's much more about them, as you'll see in a moment, that's really impressive. What I can tell you about Ms. Dasake is she's been here before. This is her second visit to Highland, and she did such a wonderful job. Frankly, we don't have many people come back for these events. We try to spread the wealth, but she did such a wonderful job that we asked her to come back, so I'm delighted to have her back. Thank you so much. Mr. Liebman I just met yesterday, but I already know something absolutely fascinating about this man, which is that there is a newspaper, or a magazine, I guess it is, that's put out by ISIS. And he has appeared in this magazine.
Not voluntarily.
Not voluntarily, that's right. Apparently, right, he is not being presented as someone that ISIS is particularly fond of, which is pretty impressive, I have to say. That's wonderful. And the greatest thing I thought when he was explaining this to me is the thing he really was annoyed about was the picture they used, which is not his favorite picture. So we have two wonderful guests to help us get through this thicket of confusion, and to let you know who they are a little bit better, we have Mary Swallow, who's going to come up and help her introduce.
afraid you have to listen to me before we get to turn it over to our guest today. So we're almost there. We're very close. My name is Mary Swallow. I'm a senior here at Hiram College, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you not one, but two accomplished guests from the RAND Corporation. Dahlia Dasakay is a political scientist at RAND and the director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy. Her academic career has taken her all over the map, from teaching at UCLA's International Institute and Berkel Center to the George Washington University to the University of Amsterdam, where she was a visiting scholar at the Netherlands Institute of International Relations. In addition, she served as a counsel of Foreign Relations International Affairs at the Dutch Foreign Ministry. During Kay's career, she has won various awards and impressive recognition, including the Brookings Research Fellowship and the John Gardner Fellowship for Public Service. Kay comes to Hiram today with a multitude of publications on Middle East security issues, both as an author and co-author. A few of her works include The Limits of Iranian Power, in which she discusses Iran's capabilities as a regional power, along with the fear and resistance of their Middle East neighbors to its influence. Talking to the Enemy, Track 2 Diplomacy in the Middle East and South Asia, Israel and Iran, A Dangerous Rivalry, and Containing Iran, What Does It All Mean? So, big questions and hopefully some answers. Also joining us today from the RAND Corporation is Andrew Littman, a policy analyst. He worked for more than 30 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, a career which featured achievements such as the Deputy Chief of the CIA's Office of Near East and South Asian Analysis, the Deputy Director of the Office of Weapons Intelligence, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation, the Chief of the Office of Iraq Analysis, and the Deputy Chief of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. After all of that, he served in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, making his way from the Deputy Director of NCTC to retiring 3 years ago as the Principal Deputy. He focused on the Middle East and terrorism issues and somehow, I don't know how, found time to co-write several articles, including Alternative Futures for Syria, Regional Implications and Challenges for the United States, where he analyzes how the possible outcomes of civil war in Syria will affect both Middle East and United States policies, Choices for America in a Turbulent World, Strategic Rethink, and the cost of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From their extensive and extremely impressive biographies, I'm sure we are all excited to hear them speak instead of any of us, in relation to ISIS, Iran, and Israel. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dahlia Dasakay and Andrew Littman. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Mary. Where did you just disappear? Really great training here at Hiram College with the Garfield Fellows. We might have to keep us posted on your career, because we might have to hire you at RAND someday. Very well said. And James, thank you for that introduction. I feel like I could be Ashton Carter and walk off the stage right now, because you covered a lot of ground and a lot of the issues I think both Andy and I planned to touch on. And the truth is, it is complicated. You did a brilliant job. I'm not sure we're going to make it less complicated for you. I have a feeling many of you will leave here feeling even more distraught at the complications and difficulties in the Middle East today. In fact, I've been looking at the region for a number of years, and I'm not sure I've ever seen it quite in this turmoil, this much uncertainty about its future, this much violence. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there is a way ahead, but these are difficult times we're going through. So that was a great overview. The good news is I'm going first, and I am talking about a country that is still a country, which is Iran, not a formerly. Prince is very popular in the Middle East, maybe, because so many countries are formerly known as. But Iran is still really Iran, and that's what I'm going to focus on. And Andy is then going to turn to the ISIS situation, the counter coalition fighting the Islamic State, particularly Syria and Iraq. And as you're going to see, and I didn't know you'd have a map of the Middle East, so we're going to go straight to the Iran stuff. But if you'll get anything out of this talk, you're going to see, and I know it was in the title, how everything in the Middle East connects to everything else. So while we're dividing this topic up in Q&A, it will become clear, and I think James gave a good preview of that, how all of these countries and actors relate to each other, sometimes in very contradictory ways. So I want to talk about Iran first, and what I want to do, because I spent so much time talking about the Iran deal over the summer when we were in this heated debate. It's interesting how quickly we can forget these things. But what I will do is just first say a few words about the nuclear deal that was negotiated on July 14th over this summer and hotly debated in our Congress, around the world, and many universities and other centers of learning. I will say a few words about that. We can get into more details in Q&A. But what I really want to focus on is thinking a little bit about post-deal implications, because I think it's really important to look at this deal. Of course, we're going to have to track its implementation, but we need to figure out where are things moving forward, what are the implications of this deal in particular, and this is what I'll be covering in the remainder of the talk. What are the implications of this deal for the broader region, for critical allies like Israel, for Iranian domestic politics itself, and finally for U.S. policy, which is, is not always difficult. It's not always easy to figure out where we're going. So let's just start with the deal itself. And this is a White House graph, by the way, just full disclosure here, as the title says, because this is the White House version. Of course, there was a debate, because not everybody subscribes to the White House view that all pathways to a nuclear bomb will be blocked. But essentially, I think it is a good graphic so that you can get an overview of what this deal was ultimately about. This deal was ultimately about trying to block all potential Iranian pathways. They have a civilian nuclear program. The whole point of this deal was to prevent Iran from being able to weaponize its nuclear program. Because the last thing you need in a Middle East in turmoil, as it is today, is to add into the mix Iran, a country of 80 million people, a major regional power, strongly disliked by many of its neighbors. The last thing you need to throw into that mix is a nuclear-armed state. There is one nuclear-armed state in the region that's kind of the worst-kept secret of the region, but nobody wanted a Persia nuclear state in terms of the rivalry between Arab and Shia. So that was the main objective. You cannot like this deal because you don't like Iran, and that's what a lot of the debate was about, in fact. But this deal was about arms control. It was about preventing a nuclear-armed Iran and all pathways. And the pathways are presented here. I don't want to get into technicalities. We actually have really great technical experts in the audience. But essentially, trying to prevent an enrichment pathway at two key facilities, a plutonium pathway. These are various ways that you can weaponize civilian programs. And ultimately also having a very intrusive inspection regime to prevent or to monitor the implementation of this agreement. And that is essentially what this deal was about. And in exchange for Iran agreeing to roll back its nuclear program and the international community verifiably monitoring this rollback, sanctions would be lifted. Not all sanctions. Not U.S., a lot of U.S. sanctions are actually still going to be on Iran, but the UN sanctions, the secondary sanctions against European trade with Iran, and this is going to be a significant boost to the Iranian economy, although that's still under debate. But that was what this grand bargain was about, but it's ultimately an arms control agreement. And this is another White House chart, but I think it's a useful one in the sense that it also shows you in the debate over the deal. It was an unfortunately very politicized debate, which is really, I think, unfortunate because it's a key national security issue where you really should have a bipartisan consensus. But people sometimes forgot what you were comparing the deal to. What alternative were you comparing it to? It's not a perfect deal. No arms control agreement is a perfect deal. In any negotiation, nobody is going to walk away completely satisfied. Everybody is going to have to compromise because if you don't, you're not going to get an agreement. There has to be something that both sides gain from the deal and something both sides have to give. So it's not a perfect agreement, but it is better. In my view, I ultimately came out, and at RAND we don't have a position on any one issue. We're a nonpartisan research institution. But my own personal assessment, and many of my colleagues shared this, was a cost-benefit assessment. And in my cost-benefit assessment, this agreement, if implemented, and that's still a big if, but if implemented, puts us in a much better place than the alternative, which was Iran months away from the ability to enrich enough nuclear material to eventually produce one bomb. Of course, it would still take more time for them to make it small enough to put on a warhead, so it's not like Iran would get a bomb in 2 or 3 months, but this was the situation we were in, dangerously close. And this is why there was such a push and so much international consensus to get this agreement. With a deal, we are really essentially buying ourselves a lot of time. And this, I know you can't read all the details in that graph, but the reason I wanted to put this up here is just to clarify a couple myths about this deal. There's a sense that, it expires in 10 years, or it expires in 15 years. Well, it is true, a lot of the rollback on enrichment capability that the Iranians agreed to, those are the red areas, are time limited. They will end, some in 10, some in 15 years. Some aspects of the program, they're plutonium, they're basically filling the core with cement. That's not easy to reverse anytime soon. And some of the monitoring and verification mechanisms are actually in place 20, 25 years, and some are indefinite. Iran agreed to what's called the Additional Protocol of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is a much more stringent, not perfect, but more stringent monitoring system than what you currently have in place for Iran today. There's really an unprecedented international inspections regime in place, a special mechanism. I'm not going to get into all the details. Again, not perfect, lots of holes. There are lots of ways to improve it. A lot of smart people are thinking about ways to improve it as it moves forward, as you monitor, as there's potentially Iranian cheating. But the bottom line is you got to do a cost-benefit assessment. Are we safer? Are we in a better position today? In my view, yes. And I would like to see this deal play out, because the last thing you would have wanted, and after July 14th, when it wasn't just an agreement between the US and Iran, it was the entire international community, us and Iran. The last thing you wanted was the US to walk away from the table. In my view, hopefully this deal will go forward successfully. That's the good outcome. And in the Middle East, we need a good outcome, because it is a mess today. But in worst case scenario, if the Iranians cheat, let the Iranians be the one to violate the deal. And the blame squarely placed on the Iranians, so that we still have the international consensus to reinstate sanctions to keep Iran isolated. But let's not be blamed by the international community that we were the ones that walked away from the table. This is a very good deal in arms control terms. It's not perfect, but it's good. So I think it's important to give the deal time to play out, and then we have to monitor it carefully. But one point I do want to keep in mind is that a lot of the concern about this deal, and this is where I get to the implications for the broader region and neighbors, and in Iran itself, a lot of the concerns about the deal did not have to do with the details of the deal that I just very briefly outlined for you. A lot of the concern about the deal was fundamental mistrust about Iran and its intentions and its role in the broader region. And James, I think, previewed this very well. And if you look at the map I have up here, and the green part shows Iran, its neighbor Iraq, but basically, and in Yemen a little bit, and Bahrain, basically Shia-populated areas of the Middle East, and the blue is Sunni-populated areas of the Middle East in terms of majority population. Essentially, there's been long-standing conflict between Persia and Arabs, and this is kind of an ongoing thing. But I would say, especially since the 2003 Iraq War, where basically the United States invasion of Iraq got rid of a Sunni leader in a Shia-dominated country, Saddam Hussein, and led to the perception in the region that we basically, the US, ironically handed Iraq to the Iranians. It was almost a gift. And so since 2003, and now with the nuclear deal, you're hearing all these fears resurfacing again. There's this concern of what King Abdullah of Jordan once called a growing Shia crescent. This idea that Iran and all its Shia allies in the region are they're going to take over, and they're threatening core Arab interests, and they're not just threatening it in their immediate backyard, but they have proxy groups and allies in Yemen. We see that now in the fight with the Houthis. They have interest in Afghanistan. They have interest in the Levant. They have ties, especially strong ties with Hezbollah, the non-state actor operating out of Lebanon, that is one of Israel's most significant threats. So the idea is that Iran's tentacles are reaching across the region and posing significant threats. And to be honest, not that the nuclear threat itself wasn't a concern, but I would